for the past 10 years at UNC-G, she has taught courses such as the Medicis and Florence. But since 2008, she began teaching a course that might be surprising to some people. The title of the course is Art 210, The Art of Disney and Pixar. The course is only offered every 2 years and fills up immediately. It is the fruit of 15 years of ongoing research on the relationship of art and fine art and animation, which includes regular visits by Dr. Holian to the Pixar studios in Emeryville, California. Dr. Holian's articles and papers on the placement of animation within the history of Western art have been published in scholarly reviews, anthologies, and this year she's going to be presenting 2 papers, both at CCAC and at the College Art Conference. So I'm just very pleased to invite Dr. Holian to get started, and I'm looking forward to her talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here sharing this work of Pixar with you. Before I start, a couple of words about me, a little more than what Edie said. Many of you may be wondering, as my Renaissance colleagues are, why I ended up, or how I ended up studying contemporary studio animation, and Pixar in particular, when my background is in Italian Renaissance art history, which is to say that for a good part of the past decade, I've researched and published on various aspects of 16th century Italian portraits, like the 2 you see here. 2 things happened that changed this career path, which was fairly normal up to this point. First, in the spring of 2008, I met Pixar animator Adam Burke, who was invited to UNC-G by the enterprising head of the art department to speak to my new Art of Disney and Pixar course, which I had revised from one I taught in graduate school, and I was offering it for the first time on campus. Adam and I became close friends, and after our initial meeting, and 6 months later, Adam invited me to Pixar. Second, the spark that set the intellectual wheels in motion, so to speak, was seeing WALL-E during the summer of 2008, which I did before my first trip to the studio. Here in the theater, I saw the strongest evidence to date for the consideration of animation as a fine art form. WALL-E was and is timeless, thought-provoking, engaging, emotionally resonant, and at times visually sublime, at least in my opinion. But the creative and clever end credits of this film were the final revelation for me. As WALL-E rolled through the history of Western art, from cave paintings to Van Gogh, I excitedly wondered if Pixar was consciously and subtly suggesting that the studio, and this film in particular, deserved consideration within the very art history into which these characters were purposefully inserted. Although I've since learned from my interviews with Pixar story artists that the primary goal of these end credits was to provide a positive and concise epilogue to the film, the presence of WALL-E and Eve within paintings bearing the distinctive styles of well-studied and revered fine artists such as Joseph Turner, George Seurat, this is my favorite, and Vincent van Gogh also succeeds, I believe, and regardless of intent, in raising some important and timely questions. Namely, does studio animation deserve a place within the history of Western fine art? Does Pixar? It may surprise some of you to learn that the question of studio animation's artistic status is not a new topic. In fact, it has a history almost as old as the medium itself, and for a few moments, I'd like to go back in time and take a look at this history with you, starting here with Winsor McCay, who was the first American to make an animated cartoon, which he did now more than 200 years ago in the year 1911. The short, entitled Little Nemo, is on the right in a couple of hand-colored strips. Besides being the father of the American animated cartoon, McCay also notably felt very strongly that animation should be an art form, and he was vocal about this view. In 1927, at a banquet given in his honor by New York City animators, McKay gave a speech and then concluded by chiding his hosts. He declared, quote, "Animation should be an art. That is how I conceived it. But what I see, what you fellows have done with it, is making it into a trade. Not an art, but a trade. Bad luck." End of quote. McKay's use of the word art is not generic. He specifically means fine art. Indeed, he envisioned art museums of the future, meaning today's museums, as containing not paintings or sculpture, but moving pictures, animated films. He felt that animation was more relatable than the static arts because, like us, it moves. Not surprisingly, his view at this early date was virtually unique. And looking around the gallery next door, I can't help but feel that this show is exactly what a prophetic McKay had in mind. The notion that animation might in fact be an art form didn't gain strength until the 1930s and early 40s, when Walt Disney was routinely hailed by writers and critics of every stripe as the innovative creator of a new art form. For example, one critic declared Walt, quote, "the most significant figure in graphic art since Leonardo da Vinci," end quote. While the curator of painting at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York confidently stated that Walt was, quote, "a great historical figure in the development of American art," end quote. Disney studio films also received similar praise. For example, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the first feature-length animated cartoon ever made, was promptly identified as, quote, "great art" when it was released in 1937. While a year later, the collective animated cartoons of the Walt Disney Studios were described by one art critic as a means by which, quote, "art comes to the common man," end quote. Nor were the completed films and shorts of the Walt Disney Studios the only works to be discussed in this manner. In 1940, the editor of a prominent art publication described the more than 300 Fantasia drawings then making their way around the country in a touring exhibition as, quote, "fine art under any definition of the term," and declared the art museum was, quote, "exactly where they should be exhibited," end quote. These last comments are of particular interest given the source, specific designation as, quote, "fine art" for animation concept drawings, and the unqualified statement that they belong in art museums, where incidentally by 1940, hundreds of pre-production and production works of art from the Disney Studios had already been exhibited, beginning as early as 1932. If you glance down this list of exhibiting institutions, you see an impressive collection of the most significant fine art museums in the US. It's like the who's who of the American fine art world. All of these display Disney Studio pre-production and production artwork in the 30s and early 40s. Given what I've just outlined, it's not surprising to discover that even a cursory survey of the remarks written about Walt and his studio's productions during these years reveals that the word art and Disney were used in tandem many, many times. And indeed, it seems to me that what these writers were indirectly asking for, arguing for, and in some cases simply stating was that Walt Disney and his studio deserved consideration within the history of modern fine art, and that they thought he and his studio's productions belonged in that history. So what happened? Why aren't our major fine art museums all showing work by animation studios and individual animators? Or at the very least, given what I've said about Disney, why isn't celebrated Disney pre-production or production artwork hanging permanently in art museums? Before posing possible answers to these questions, it would probably be useful to tackle the subjective and problematic definition of the word art, which I use here to mean fine art with a capital A. The question, what is art, is a theoretical and philosophical query which often produces deeply personal responses. While we can probably all pretty much agree that some things, like the Sistine Chapel, are art, and others, like works created by animals, in this case cats, are probably not worthy of that definition, as cute as the process might be, it is that vast gray area in between these two poles that forms the battlefield of modern art criticism. I've discovered from my work on animation that this gray area is much smaller for many who collectively shape what is studied, taught, read about, and viewed in galleries and museums as art. This powerful and elite group includes art critics, curators of fine art institutions, gallery owners, collectors, as well as many contemporary art scholars. Ultimately, this group's artistic worldview, if we can call it that, is surprisingly narrow, traditional, and rather black and white, which is only one of the reasons this current show at Greenhill is so fascinating to me, trailblazing, and indeed brave. It is also the exception that proves the rule. Unfortunately, within the body of art criticism that this influential group I just mentioned both produces and endorses, the question, is it fine art, rarely gets asked about so-called popular or commercially successful art forms. This assures their permanent position outside rather than inside the history of art, which I mean here as the canonical history, works that are universally or near universally accepted as great and studied as such through the centuries. These works are held up as culturally and significantly important. Significant and I should say artistically important as well. So this bias against popular and commercially successful art forms is especially unfortunate for an art form like animation, which, as you can see from the exhibit next door, incorporates many traditional media within its pre-production and production processes. I like to ask, and I have in my work, do these techniques and materials not require the same skill, virtuosity, creativity, dexterity, and talent in the hand of an animation concept artist, production designer, and animator as they do in the hand of a traditional studio artist exhibiting in New York, LA, Chicago, etc. Indeed, given that animation artists collectively employ such a range of traditional media en route to determining a film's final style and overall appearance, I believe that based on this fact alone, animation generally, and studio animation in particular, has a legitimate claim to fine art consideration, if not outright status. Although this suggestion is tantamount to cultural sacrilege in some corners of the fine art world today, the subject, as I noted a moment ago, was being repeatedly tackled and debated publicly during the 1930s and early 40s in relation to the work of Walt and his studio. In fact, until the late 1950s, the Walt Disney Studio was the only studio identified as producing art with a capital A. As a result, the Disney Studios became, in effect, the torchbearer for animation, and therefore I would suggest that for better or worse, what happened to Disney within the art world ultimately had major implications for the entire medium and its future place in fine arts institutions and its history. So let's pick up with that history once again and see what happened. Well, the favorable critical tide enjoyed by Disney began to turn around 1943. The tone in the press became increasingly negative, and this continued. Some critics wondered aloud why Walt had, as they put it, squandered what they perceived as his promising beginning with Snow White and Pinocchio. His push for realism and his fascination with technology were faulted by others. Some critics simply stopped writing about Walt and his studio altogether, making the silence deafening. Finally, the way Walt handled the very public studio strike of 1941 might have hastened critical disapproval, and in fact, he had to leave the country, and federal labor negotiators had to be brought into the studio to solve the problem. Now, in fairness to Walt and his studio, I do not believe this shift, especially among art critics in particular, was due entirely to the changed product coming out of Burbank or to any change of taste among the movie-going public. The art world itself, which had heaped praise on Walt and his studio, had also changed. And like American culture as a whole, it would continue to change, and rapidly, in the post-war years. So let me give you an example of how I think this shift impacted animation. In 1942, the largest Disney exhibition to date was mounted at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It focused on the film Bambi, which had just been released. So what's going on in 1942 America? Well, the US is at war, and Americans at home were working around the clock, building planes, tanks, artillery, you name it, and they were doing it significantly on assembly lines, like this factory in this Pennsylvania defense plant. This environment impacted the Bambi exhibition in key ways. First, artistic and aesthetic qualities, which had been emphasized in previous Disney art exhibitions, were played down here. Second, artists remained anonymous, as they had in the past, but here the emphasis, according to one favorable review of the show, was on animation as a, quote, democratic group-oriented art, end quote, that employed, quote, both machines and personal talent, end quote, and was described in museum literature as being completed with efficiency at a Walt Disney studio built very much like a modern factory, end quote. The result of this approach was that both art and artists were presented as anonymous cogs within a mighty wheel of production. These were positive qualities for art in 1942 America, where mass production, assembly lines, and efficiency were highly valued. But I believe these same qualities proved to be extremely damning for animation later on. After the war was over, the preference was, more than usual, for the solo, even rebellious creative genius who toiled away in artistic solitude plotting a new course for art. This was seen as representing the brave American spirit, freedom, individuality, independence. These qualities, it was believed, were epitomized best by painter Jackson Pollock, who you see working on the left, and on the right is one of his characteristic paintings. Collaboration and anything faintly evoking factory production was now entirely out of fashion. This was due in no small part to the extremely influential writing of art critic Clement Greenberg, for whom art forms such as commercial art, illustration, comics, and even Hollywood movies were singled out as loathsome products only adored by the uncultured masses. Greenberg, who you see here, notably identified these art forms as, quote, kitsch, or, quote, low art, not to be confused with the, quote, avant-garde or high art created by artists like Pollock, whom Greenberg enthusiastically championed. Unfortunately, from this period forward, the discussion of Disney animation, or any studio animation as fine art, virtually disappeared from the dialogue of art criticism. And when it did appear again, it disappeared just as rapidly. Now at this point, some of you may be justifiably wondering whether a discussion about the fine art definition, recognition, and/or acceptance of studio animation ultimately matters. I believe it does. In fact, the answer, I think, is a resounding yes, and here's why. At present, animation as a medium is almost completely absent from the written histories of art, which determine what is taught, studied, remembered, and ultimately considered artistically important. This situation is disturbing, and I believe does fine art no favors either, particularly when considering that art's history is meant to document the most significant artistic contributions of a culture or time. In 1997, animation scholar Paul Wells boldly but correctly, I believe, stated that, quote, animation is the most important art form of the 20th century because it is, as he put it, an art form that encompasses all other art forms, end quote. Today, it's Pixar and not Disney that is the artistic torchbearer for studio animation. Since the 1993 release of Toy Story, the history's first 3D animated feature, Pixar has received the same volume and quality of critical acclaim that was amassed by the Disney studios of the 1930s and 40s, the very years that found animation a topic of discussion, or in the art world at least. And so, here in 2013, as a record number of animated features are released, and Pixar celebrates 27 years of art and filmmaking with another Academy Award, and the continuing international tour of the Pixar Art Exhibition, which is now in its 7th year, I can think of no better time to revisit, and if you'll pardon the pun, reanimate this topic. After all, what are the fundamental elements that make an object fine art? Mastery and exploration of medium, quality, which stands up to careful scrutiny, analysis, and multiple viewings, a timeless resonance in subject and meaning that transcends or will transcend the time in which it was made, a style or method of execution appropriate to the subject, and lastly, that intangible element that sets the work apart, making it come alive or jump off the wall or screen at you. This last element, this intangible element, is what makes art so hard to define. And yet, the verdict is already out on this intangible with regards to Pixar. One only has to read the mountains, literally mountains, of critical reviews of their films to understand that these films have this distinguishing quality in spades, whether it is precisely articulated by the reviewer or not. Fortunately, the contemporary art world's definition of what constitutes fine art is also expanding and has begun to include select animation crafted by solo creators or small groups of artists such as William Kentridge, whose work you see here in the Museum of Modern Art on the left, and Paul Chen, whose piece appears on the right. However, despite this slow expansion, there are inescapable and important facets of studio animation's very nature that unfairly create biases against a serious artistic consideration of the work created by artists working at Pixar or any animation studio at present. It is upon these sometimes irrational and often hypocritical biases of my field that I now wish to focus, starting with collaboration. Animated films are enormous collaborative endeavors. This process of making calls upon artists and animators to frequently change or sublimate their own personal style in favor of producing a cohesive whole which is larger than the sum of its parts and is guided by the vision of a director. And here on the screen you have, this is Teddy Newton, and he's sitting with part of his crew for Day and Night, the short that Pixar released a couple of years back. And this is Andrew Stanton, a young Andrew Stanton, with his crew from Finding Nemo. And then down below I'm showing you a generic shot of the Pixar atrium so you get a sense of some of the staff. And it's lunchtime, so it's crowded. The collaborative working method, this collaborative working method I just described, actually has quite a strong precedent in the history of Western art, where instead of a director, a master artist or master mason guided the artistic vision. For example, take these large and incredibly famous paintings by Raphael in his studio that are located in the Vatican. They were started around 1510 for the Pope's private apartments by a studio workforce of variously skilled young men at different stages of their artistic education. According to their strengths, Raphael assigned them to paint secondary or tertiary portions of the composition using his designs, while he executed the most prominent areas of the frescoes himself. In this manner, Raphael occupied a directorial role in the execution of his artistic vision. Raphael's design and distinct style not only run through the entire painted decoration of these rooms, despite the work of several hands over several years, but the final project ultimately bears his single name, and indeed he was ultimately responsible for it. Interestingly, Pixar story artist Kevin O'Brien also made a similar point to me in an interview when he specifically mentioned the medieval cathedrals of Europe. And here I show you Notre Dame in Paris. Kevin says this, quote, "If the great cathedrals are considered great monuments of Western art, I don't see why an animated film shouldn't be. They emanate from a single architect or director, but both take scores of craftspeople and artists to create over long periods and are made to be experienced by the general public," end quote. Truth be told, the vast majority of fine art made before the middle of the 17th century and some afterwards was made according to the studio or workshop model, even if today we associate a single artist's name with the final work. In fact, there are some famous, critically acclaimed contemporary artists who continue to work or have recently worked in this traditional collaborative manner. For example, the environmental installation artist Christo and his wife Jean-Claude, who actually depended upon, she's recently passed away, depended upon an army of skilled and unskilled workers to make their ambitious projects happen. And this image over here on the left is from 1969, and you see Christo here directing as about 120 paid workers wrap 1 million square feet of Australian coastline. This project was up for 10 weeks, and then the project was taken down and workers returned to help them remove the material. In the bottom right, you see the gates from Central Park, February of 2005. This project was up for 16 days, and again, they depended on the help of about 125 people who they paid to erect 7,500 metal gates that are 16 to 18 feet in height, and then to take them down after the project was over with. The second example I have for you is draftsman and sculptor Sol LeWitt, who was known for his genre-defying wall drawings. Before his death in 2007, LeWitt developed the complicated idea and plan for hundreds of large-scale drawings, while the physical execution of each piece was and still is carried out by a diverse array of amateur and professional artists who are credited on the work after LeWitt. My last collaborative example is sculptor Matthew Barney, whose work is perhaps the most appropriate collaborative comparison to studio animation from the contemporary art world. Barney hired an entire film crew to bring his series of 5 ambitious Cremaster films to the screens of art museums between 1994 and 2003. And he's here on the left in makeup. He actually starred in these films as well, and is still on the right. Just like other cinematic works, the hundreds of collaborators Barney directed are individually acknowledged in the films themselves, which interestingly are now widely available on DVD for home viewing through Amazon and other sites. So there's a strong commercial aspect to his work, which I also find interesting. So as all of these examples demonstrate, the fine art world is clearly not without canonical modern precedents for large-scale collaborative work involving dozens, if not hundreds of individuals. Therefore, one would surmise that such a method of making should in no way taint the validity of an artistic product, but on the contrary, lend it a pedigree. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite work that way. Here's why. This brings us to obstacle number 2, the artist genius bias. The presiding historical preference in the Western world is for works created by, or at least attributed to, a single identifiable artistic personality. Right, return here to Raphael again. On the right, you're looking at a self-portrait of the artist that comes from right there. Note how we identify the works in the Vatican as by Raphael, not Raphael with help from Giulio Romano, Perino del Vaga, etc., even though art historians know these artists worked there and in fact contributed huge sections of the frescoes. Indeed, the cult of the artist and the related belief in the artist genius archetype are powerful forces in Western art history and culture with deep roots in the ancient world, only to be reborn, as expected, in the Renaissance, with Leonardo and especially Michelangelo, both of whom you see here in 16th century woodcuts. The godlike status ascribed to these two individuals largely resided in the idea that they could rival or best even God with their artistic powers of creation. In his own lifetime, after all, Michelangelo's biographer famously described him as, quote, rather divine than human, end quote. The historically resilient preference in the West for a single recognizable artist's name persists even today, with mostly unfortunate side effects, one of which is a general bias against large collaborative projects, especially those where each hand is not individually recognizable within the work, or where the work is not attributable to a single individual. Both of these are true of studio animation, which of course depends upon stylistic homogeneity and many artists, even if at the same time depending upon strong, independent artistic vision within the collaboration. It seems Walt Disney intuitively understood this cultural preference for the single identifiable individual when in 1925 he changed the name of his fledgling studio from the Disney Brothers Studio to Walt Disney Studio. You can see the sign here, and then this is a blow-up of that sign there. When they moved, it's not a very big staff, as you can see. When they move into the larger studio, he changes the name. And this decision was not simply good business. The renaming and Walt's subsequent behavior, publicly especially, reflects an understanding of the Western preference for crediting a single creative individual. The last point I wish to make with regard to the artist genius bias relates to film. Studio animation is undoubtedly linked to the art of film, and film is acknowledged as an art form by the contemporary art world. However, film is not usually perceived as a fine art unless an acknowledged cinematic auteur or fine artist like Andy Warhol, Marcel Duchamp, or Matthew Barney made it. And notice those are all individuals' names. Therefore, even important films, which undoubtedly were seen by fine artists, even influenced them perhaps as they sat in the audience and watched them, these do not appear in fine art textbooks next to contemporary painting, contemporary sculpture. So there seems to be a kind of careful but odd distinction being made here between the static and the cinematic arts. In truth, it's a very porous division, even more so with regard to animation for the reasons I've already noted. All right, the next two challenges I wish to focus on are interconnected, so I'll talk about them together. Namely, the availability of Pixar films, or any large studio films, products, releases, and the environment in which they're experienced. Like our love of the individual artistic personality, Western culture has also traditionally suffered from the mystique of the unique object. And this depends, or I should say this is despite, the tradition-shattering work of Andy Warhol, who was known for his stencil screen prints. This process creates a series of works that are almost, but not exactly identical, and the hand pressure and ink application are affected by the fact that humans are doing the inking. You see his Maryland print over here on the left. On the right is a view into his studio, and some of these prints are laid out on the ground there. In the early 1960s, Warhol radically challenged the traditional notions of fine art making by delegating the physical creation of his works to paid assistants, who he oversaw in his studio, which he famously named the factory. Through his working method, Warhol not only questioned the idea of the privileged unique original made by the solo artist genius, but his provocative work also blurred the lines between fine art and pop culture, or Clement Greenberg's low art and high art. However, despite Warhol, the greatest, even quasi-holy value is still placed upon the single rare, original object experienced in its original location or within the hallowed spaces of a museum or gallery. The general bias for the one single object is incredibly powerful and pervasive today, even when, I would say, nonsensical. For example, in a bizarre turn of events, the few fine art animators who have been accepted into major galleries and museums are currently issuing their films in very small, limited editions to meet the demands of the art market model. Therefore, the preciousness of a work derives not simply from scarcity or antiquity, but can be artificially imposed, even on a medium that it doesn't particularly fit well. This is a modern phenomenon of the fine art world and happens with all media capable of mass production, which are also accepted into fine arts elite ranks, like photography and prints. In stark contrast, the productions of animation studios exist in thousands of copies for dissemination and viewing in one of the most accessible of public spaces, the movie theater. Far from holy, and not the slightest bit intimidating, and requiring no previous knowledge from its audience for complete enjoyment, the average movie theater is in many ways the complete opposite of most art museums and galleries. About the only thing less formal than a movie theater, especially today, is one's own home, which of course is where a Pixar film ultimately resides after it is reproduced even further for Blu-ray and DVD viewing. It nearly goes without saying that unlike fine art institutions, these more casual, less structured viewing environments have no cultural gatekeeper, while the existence of multiples, in this case millions of identical multiples, challenges the very nature of what we as Westerners still value in art, despite Warhol, namely the scarce object or unique original. And yet, unlike traditional media, animation does not suffer in reproduction. No brushwork is lost or texture made invisible. And depending upon the home theater it's played on, a DVD or Blu-ray can come quite near to reproducing the initial viewing experience. No doubt this quality is a hindrance to studio animation's fine art considerations, and perhaps even threatening to the fine art world's markets and institutions. For as critic and historian Walter Benjamin famously suggested in 1936, quote, "That which withers in the age of mechanical reproduction is the aura of a work of art," end quote. And by aura here, he means the mystery or the power, the magnetism that a rare original possesses. And Benjamin made this comment well before mass media exponentially multiplied the number of times something could be reproduced through TV, video, and the internet. As Bill McCulloch notes in his outstanding 1996 study of early Disney art exhibitions, many fine art institutions strive to, quote, as he puts it, preserve the aura of a work, and it is critical that they do so, since this aura is indeed vital to their funding and existence. The next consideration in this debate is technology. And here photography provides an interesting comparison to studio animation, and I'm showing you here a mid-19th century photo studio with the two cameras set up there on the side. And what's really interesting about this image, especially for me, somebody who studied portraits for a good long time, is that you have the drawn or painted portrait here in the middle, and of course early photography ultimately ends up replacing most drawn or painted portraits. Today, nobody would argue against the fine art legitimacy of photography, but that was not always the case. The highly technical, even chemical knowledge required of its practitioner worked against photography's early acceptance as fine art. Also, the fact that photography required mechanical equipment in the form of a camera to create an image made it suspect, since the camera was seen as distancing the artist from the subject and in turn eliminating that valuable, detectable hand of the artist's genius. Critics were also suspicious that the machinery was somehow making the work. Studio animation shares these same impediments. Despite the individually created hand-produced components of both 2D and 3D animation, each have, over their history, suffered similar misconceptions on account of their technical aspects. Hand-drawn animation, after all, depends upon the camera, and in the hands of the Disney studio, many other technologies were introduced into the medium as well. And on the left, I show you an early Disney animation camera stand, and on the right, I showed you the multiplane camera. This is a complicated one. It's a 7-story multiplane camera that was invented in the 1930s at the studio. Computer animation, by definition, is even more technical than its 2D counterpart and arguably less understood as a result. 3D animation is more apt to be perceived literally as computer-generated imagery rather than computer-assisted imagery. Such misconceptions make comments like Pixar animator Angus MacLean's 2008 declaration in an online interview that, quote, "The computer is just a big dumb pencil," end quote, both important and instructive. The Greenhill exhibition is also doing wonders in this area, as is the Traveling Pixar show, because it's educating the public in the process of what happens and what goes into making 3D animated films. But in truth, truly understanding or attempting to understand the layers of technology that enable the top secret software of 3D animation studios to serve its artistic masters is virtually impossible due to its proprietary nature and, I suspect, a lack of a PhD in computer science. So, as with photography, the technical and mechanical aspects of studio animation pose challenges not associated with any other fine art medium. And this is a difficult hurdle for 3D animation to overcome in particular, regardless of who makes it, an individual or a group. For I wonder if significant portions of a work's process or the artistic tools employed in that process cannot be fully understood, studied, or critiqued by curators, historians, or art critics, the people shaping art's history and our experience of it, will that fact impact the value or frustrate the legitimacy of that work within the fine art world? Is the highly sophisticated technology employed by 3D animation studios therefore an impediment to elite art status? These are fascinating and highly relevant questions, I think, but as yet with no current answer. The last obstacle I wish to mention is the commercial aspect of studio animation, and I show you here a Warhol print, which seemed appropriate. This is something we can certainly tackle further in the Q&A, but I want to address it here briefly because in the more than 65 interviews I've conducted with Pixar artists and animators in the last 5 years, where I've asked about the fine art status of animation, this reason has come up most often as a concern or as an eliminating factor with regards to studio animation's fine art legitimacy. This is from Pixar staff members. More can certainly be said on this topic, but here's my brief take. It's true, Pixar and animation studios generally are in the business of making films for profit. The studio is a commercial enterprise. It is also true that the fine art world, despite auction houses and for-profit galleries, hypocritically frowns on the mix of commercialism and art. However, what is rarely remembered by the fine art world is that the commercialism of art is nearly as old as the making of art. In fact, the art world, or I should say the art market, as we know it, is a relatively new phenomenon. For most of art's history, an artist provided a product, be it a painted altarpiece, a wooden chest, a marble sculpture, stained glass window, plans for a house, some structure. You get where I'm going with this. This was how he, and less commonly she, supported their families, paid for their home, clothed, and fed themselves. Nor was art made for art's sake, or to satisfy the spiritual needs or creative impulse of the artist. This notion would be, in fact, be quite foreign to most pre-17th century artists, and yet we don't value as lesser the commissioned works of Rembrandt, Leonardo, Bernini, or even the later John Singer Sargent, who did both, works for himself and works specifically on order. The notion of a truly independent artist who does not curry favor with potential buyers or seek commissions is a modern, that is 19th century idea that is truly still new in art's more than 6,000-year history. So what happens to this discussion if we don't just consider the animated films of the studio as potential fine art, but the pre-production and production artwork as well? Well, unfortunately at present, I doubt the situation would be significantly different if history is anything to go by. It's true that the exploratory or concept and production art for these films are unique, original, rare works where the hand and/or style of the individual is often quite visible. And these works can be attributed to a single artist. They also have, in my opinion, an aura, none the least of which because they document a visual quest by dozens of individual artists that is not entirely revealed on screen. It is also true that these works would be quite valuable if they were ever sold. But even if we imagine some parallel universe where they are sold or given to art museums, early examples of this occurring with works from the Disney studios and other major studios demonstrates that museum ownership would most likely not create any noticeable long-term effect on the status of studio animation art within the fine art world. Now, that's not to say that many of these works won't have a vital role to play in this debate when it is finally broken wide open again. I'm quite certain they'll be at the center of it. After all, these works can be analyzed and understood in a language the fine art world already speaks. For example, nearly all of the exploratory or concept art for Pixar films directly reflects the hand and/or style of the individual responsible, many of whom have unique, strong artistic personalities, and it is precisely for this vision that they are included in the early stages of a story's visualization. As a result, powerful independent works made along the journey from script to screen exist within animation studios, and although they are in the service of the film, as many Pixarians have noted in interviews with me, these films are understandable to the fine art world. These must be identified and studied along with their creators. After all, I would argue that the dichotomy between the artistic collective on the one hand and the individual artist on the other is what ultimately makes animation so fascinating and challenging to categorize, and yet also distinct as a medium. So tonight I've talked about studio animation's past relationship to the fine art world, and I've discussed what I would categorize as the problematic present. So by way of conclusion, here are my thoughts on what I would call the promising future. Every semester I teach the Art of Disney and Pixar course at UNC-G, as I am right now. My students routinely ask me when we might see Pixar films or Pixar concept art permanently installed in an American art museum. And that question is invariably followed immediately by what would need to occur for that to happen. This is the answer I'll give this fall, as I do every fall, as I've done in past semesters. Assuming Pixar continues to make outstanding, visually rich films that can be discussed and dissected like a work of art, which I believe they can be, then first, we need to see Pixar art in American fine art museums. We need to see major American museums be brave and hang a Pixar show, and to do it with the same seriousness, space considerations, and intent they would give an exhibition of Vermeer, Rodin, or Picasso. To date, the fine art world in the US has not been forced to discuss the topic I focused on tonight in my talk. They've been able to conveniently avoid the question, is studio animation fine art? To date, Pixar shows have been primarily overseas or of fairly short duration, like the MoMA show in New York, or they've happened outside the epicenters of the American art scene. To put it bluntly, American fine art institutions, curators, and critics have been protected, or in this case protected themselves, from tackling this sticky topic because the Pixar shows have been out of sight and out of mind. This needs to change. Now obviously the Pixar show in any forum for any length of time brings attention to the art and artists responsible, which is extremely valuable. Coverage is a good thing when you're trying to affect a dialogue and get people talking, and this includes questioning and research, which brings me to number 2. Scholars, critics, writers, other fine artists need to start publicly taking Pixar and all studio animated films and their art seriously. Doesn't mean we have to accept them all as fine art, but we need to talk about them that way and ask and question as we would any other work. Again, it's about these individuals, these actors, being part of this dialogue. They need to participate. If anybody or any studio can get them to do this, I do believe it's Pixar. Look at how this studio has caused the film world to begin to see animation as a medium on par with live action filmmaking and worthy of its top awards. And I'm thinking here about The Incredibles, WALL-E, and Up. It's taken a while, but change in dialogue is happening, which is very encouraging. And lastly, the art world needs to keep expanding its definition of what art is, which is why shows like the one here at Greenhill are so vital. And speaking for myself and my students, we as viewers, scholars, and critics need to get past some of the biases of our own Western culture. And so putting these biases aside, I propose not only that the animation fine art debate be reopened and engaged in with the same passion and conviction witnessed in the first half of the 20th century, but also that art history as a field begin to think of studio animation on its own terms. For what does a studio collaborative of artists, animators, and technical directors do with every award-winning film or short, even if unintentionally, but submit evidence for a new way not only of defining or thinking about fine art, but also the very nature of what an artist is. And that is exciting. Thank you. Happy to answer some questions if anybody has one. Hi, Ben.
Something's been bouncing in my head anyway. Why the history of Disney and Pixar? Why not like Warner Brothers animation?
Warner Brothers does not start to get talked about as an art form until much, much later. 50s, it's discussed very briefly. There's a show, the MoMA in 50s. It's just not talked about that way ever. I mean, it takes, you know, decades, and then it's talked about briefly and then not again at all, really, until very recently. Yeah, Deb, I saw your hand emerge.
Yeah, so many of your photos here of Pixar, I assume these are all animators?
Yes, well, not animators, but artists. So, like Tia down here, we saw some of her work. She's a painter. I mean, everybody basically that's here in these images are painters.
Okay. My question is, it seems like in these particular photos that there's a predominance of men as animators. Would you consider that basically true?
Yeah.
Because I see the same correlation with mask makers, that they tend to be men.
That's interesting.
And, you know, I think that's,
There's a correlation there.
Yeah.
Animation has been, for most of its history, probably all of its history, a male-dominated field. But there are a number of women who are now working at Pixar as animators. I interviewed 2 of them last time I was there. They're young, and they're doing really interesting things. Tia Crowder, who's in the bottom right corner here, is one of the original Pixar employees, and her training is in painting. That's her background, and she's a concept artist. Maurice, did you?
The 2 early big ones, Snow White and Pinocchio, were classic.
Yeah.
And the stories moved away from that. Does that have anything to do with the loss of prestige, if you will?
I'm not sure that that's the case, because in 1950 Cinderella was released, and the critical acclaim for that film was pretty lukewarm, I would say, from the art side. I mean, the film was, a great thing to take your kids to. You don't hear the art talked about at all. And that's the first film that Mary Blair, the first feature that Mary Blair really dictated the style of. So that's kind of, to me, really seems very strange. But I just think by that time, there just was not an interest in the art world at all, in animation, at all. And it's very hard to find an interest. I've done a lot of reading of newspaper clippings and critical reviews, and there just isn't anything there. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah, Mark?
So maybe you can comment on intention, because as I see it, so you're sort of talking about the original Walt Disney films, and I'm not sure of his intention at that point, whether it was whether it was completely a money-making scheme, of course, because Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was put them out of business in making that one. And I see that, as you're saying, as they went a little bit later, Cinderella becomes more of a sort of money-making. It almost seems to me like the intention behind Cinderella becomes money-making. And by the time you make it to the 80s, the formula is in place.
Right.
And then and what scares me a little bit, as you're going into these things, is that Pixar, I feel like, is getting close to this same thing, right? So you pointed out what I think truly are the magnificent ones of Pixar, WALL-E and Up, where even interviews with John Lasseter sort of pushing away the idea of money making, right? Because in Up, that Walt Disney was really upset with them because how can we sell plush toys of old men?
Right.
But going forward, do you see the same? Are they sinking their own ship, or you can take it from there.
Well, the schedule. I mean, the next 3 years are going to be very interesting, I think, at Pixar, because they're going now to a 2-year. Every other year is a 2-film release. So next year, 2 films. The following year, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, which is a new model for them. And I feel like we need to see them go through a cycle of that, and then I could probably more accurately answer your question. Because honestly, I'm very excited about Pete Docter's new film, Inside Out. I think that's going to be kind of up material, so I'm going to be really interested. I mean, I think those kinds of films can still be made at Pixar. I don't think it's just going to be sequels. I mean, they're really interested in the original story. And in some ways, the sequels help subsidize that. I mean, I've been told by several people that WALL-E never would have happened without the success of Nemo and Cars. It bought that for them. Yeah. Yeah.
I remember when I took your class about 2 years ago, you were telling us, I think on the last day of class, you told us about projects that at the time Pixar had down in the tube, down in the pipes, like to come. And one of the ones that came true that you told us about was Wreck-It Ralph, and I saw that, and that was like a really, in particular, I feel like amazing standout piece that Pixar has done, and I can't help but notice.
That's Disney, actually.
It's Disney?
Yeah.
Like, but Pixar didn't make Wreck-It Ralph?
No, it's a, well, that's it, that you were lured into thinking that Pixar made it is exactly what Walt Disney Company wants you to think.
Because I was going to ask why you didn't have any like stuff, like art and...
Wreck-It Ralph was made entirely in Burbank. Pixar had nothing to do with it.
Interesting.
The Disney Company now has their own 3D animators that work in Burbank. Yeah, I mean, John Lasseter was Chief Creative Officer during the time it was made. I mean, he greenlit that film. There's no question about it that his flavor is in that film, but the artwork was not done at Pixar.
Well, I guess that answers my question.
Yeah, that's why it's not there. Yeah.
With talking about sequels and all that, with Walt, you know, not liking sequels and never at the time, I guess he didn't want to do sequels.
Yeah.
Why the rush of sequels to all these films all of a sudden since
Well,
I guess the mid-80s?
Walt's dead. And the company changed radically after his death. I mean, the first sequel was released long after his death. Rescuers Down Under was long after he died. They waited a long time to do that. But it was like once they burst the bubble on that, or opened Pandora's box, or whatever, there was no going back, it seems almost, in some ways. I mean, sequels of popular movies are money makers, and you know they're not going to overlook that possibility, I think. I'm speaking about the Disney side of things, my understanding of it, but they're not, you know, Walt's not alive anymore. The business is a very different, the company has a very different business model than it did when he was alive. Chris?
Yeah, that's a great talk, and I think just is a huge, huge topic in terms of
Yes.
like how it extends out.
Yes,
into
and this is much cut down from the written version of this.
Sure.
That I did.
Yeah. But I have some questions about like how one builds fences around that. But right now, actually, I just wanted to mention it. I mean, coming and looking at it from sort of like a fine art side, and thinking about how this stuff does or does not get accepted within a fine art environment. I wonder, have you looked at all of the way that the two things that leap out at me are, for a while now, haute couture, and the way that haute couture shows up in museums a lot, and doesn't seem to fulfill the kind, I mean, doesn't, you know, it has the genius, individual genius, but although they're expensive products, they're mass-produced products. And it's very much a collaborative shop kind of environment for producing things. And that's the one. And the other is the very recent show, and I apologize, I actually don't remember what museum it was at, but it was either at, I mean, it's the Herschel, is the video game show.
Yes.
And so it's another huge studio environment, collaborative, mostly as a genre, Clement Greenberg's lowbrow entertainment, and occasionally real artistic brilliance. And oftentimes by individual studios, small studios, especially independent studios, that are really pushing forward a different creative vision that people can widely recognize as being, I mean, even something like Portal, which is hugely, hugely successful, but also really, really different. And so, I mean, yeah, just thinking about like looking at those models, how do those come about? And the haute couture is easy, so it's the same freaking highbrow audience. But the video game one is in some ways maybe more interesting.
Yeah, that would be interesting to look into. You know, when the MoMA show first happened, the Pixar show in MoMA in 99 it was? I wrote the date down, when was it? Yeah, 2005 into 2006, it was 6 weeks. That show, as I've learned from talking to people at MoMA and at Pixar, enabled the Tim Burton show to happen. So it kind of, again, broke the glass ceiling. But it was a show, when the Pixar show was hung at MoMA, it was hung in hallways. It wasn't hung in a gallery, so you saw it en route to other things. And that's all, you know, but that show made it a significant amount of money. And so they went ahead and did the Tim Burton show, but I'm also wondering if the video game show might not also be coming on the heels of some of these other shows that have been at big museums. I'd like to talk to somebody at the Hirshhorn about that.
Yeah, and I think there is, I'm sorry, there is a thing where, like, if something's very big, it'll get a gallery. I mean, like NetArt went through this too, where it's like, it was really popular, people curated into stuff, and they kind of couldn't figure out what to do with it, and it tapers way off.
Yeah, thanks. Those are good suggestions. Stage?
Going on from what Chris was saying, would you think that the Barbican's Watch Me Move show, would that kind of fall into that same category, kind of success, following success of the Pixar show and the Tim Burton?
Yeah, absolutely, because Barbican used to represent the Pixar show that's now traveling internationally. That show, though, is not interested in the aesthetics of animation. It's a more process-oriented show, and it's also a global, let's look at what's happened in animated filmmaking over, the history of animation. I mean, it's not the kind of show I imagine as an aesthetics-based show. Yeah, it's a different kind of treatment. Yeah.
I was just wondering about the actual individual artists that work at these studios. Are they being recognized as fine artists, and is their work outside of the studio being put in galleries or anything?
That's a good question. Their work as Pixar artists is not being recognized because none of it exists outside of the studio. It would only exist in a show, which hasn't happened, really, not in this country at least. But Tia has an active practice outside of her studio. Bill Cohn, who's coming to the UNC-G campus in November, that all of you, I hope, will come to his talk. He has a very active studio practice and does very well for himself. And he's not afraid to say that he wouldn't be doing as well if he wasn't a Pixar artist. So it has that kind of, he benefits from the aura of Pixar a little bit there. But a lot of them, Dice, Tsumi, the young, where's the laser pointer, the guy down here, he's a painter, classically trained painter who went to School of Art in New York. He's got a very active studio practice. He's had a couple solo shows in LA. Yeah, he's kind of big, actually. So they do, many of them do have practices outside, but it's not as a Pixar artist that they do that.
Right,
Yeah. Yes?
Do you think if a movie is marketed more towards children, it's not taken as seriously?
I do. I do. And in fact, this is the big chunk I had to leave out of this talk that I deal with in the written version of this paper. I think that animation has kind of been ghettoized in that way, and so it's hard to get out of that. Pixar's worked hard to do that, but I think that animation, the minute you start talking about cartoons, Happy Mornings on Saturday mornings come to mind, rather than actually really being able to take a step back and sort of say, what is this film, how is this operating and on what levels, what's happening here. And I think that the bad TV animation of the 70s and 80s probably didn't help.
Yes.
Didn't help this medium very much. So, yeah, that's a huge problem. It's a huge problem.
But didn't Hanna-Barbera sort of keep it alive too during that time?
It did.
Even though it was a much cheaper formula?
Yeah, it did. And, it was all of these kinds of that's a great example of the continued interest and then kind of maybe made people ready for the renaissance of Disney, which happened in the late 80s. I mean, I know I was primed when that happened, and I'm sure it was from that.
Yeah. I'm just out of curiosity, why have the animation, the style animation in the 70s has gone so, bland and very rushed pace? Like, why
did that happen? Well, people lose interest in animation in the late 50s and 60s in this country, and Disney laid off huge numbers of people in the 60s and 70s. They didn't hire another new animator at the Disney studio. They stopped hiring in the 50s. They didn't hire another new animator until like 74 or something. There just wasn't an interest. Movies started to be made every 4 years, every 5 years, and the audiences weren't there. And so the TV animation is being made cheaply and quick, and it's quick and dirty, basically. Yeah,
I just wanted to add to that, there's the fact that during the 60s and 70s there was a lot of social and economic like changes and big things happening there. And I know in the 70s they had like a super bad recession, and so that's like there was just less money in general to go around, and people were going to the movies in general less, and so people were less inclined to try as hard with animation and various other kinds of things. I don't know, that's always been kind of like my own personal philosophy.
Yeah.
Well, and now that pattern's being repeated and that challenge with the 3D software being so accessible, you know, anybody can be a quote-unquote artist / animator. You can download free software and do that now. So again, you know, we're just sort of proliferating the idea that it's something that anyone can do or that a computer can do. So it's just going to happen over again. And just the lack of respect, like with studios not being recognized and being laid off. I mean, right now, lots of visual effects artists and animators are bailing and finding other work because there wasn't the work that there was.
Well, DreamWorks laid off 2,000 people in March. So.
And Rhythm and Blues just closed down. They just made Life of Pi, which is a story that couldn't have been told without them.
Right.